investigate your complaints about the treatment of old people at the Pinderfields Hospital in Wakefield. Treatment which shamed staff and shocked both patients and relatives.
I picture him crying, I picture him slumped to the ground, I picture the ward sister shouting at him, all these things. They'll never leave me, they'll never leave the family, we'll always remember these.
I won't be able to settle because there's quite a few questions that I do need to ask, and until I get answers to them, then I won't be happy. Not for my mum, because it's too late now, my mum's gone, but for all the other elderly people in this area.
Well, I felt like weeping, you know. I've never had such an experience, and I wouldn't like anybody else to have it either. They were swines to me, you know.
Pinderfields is a sprawling Victorian general hospital that stands in the heart of Wakefield. It's run by an NHS trust. Inside Pinderfields, acutely ill elderly people are treated separately from other patients. It's from the 2 wards for the elderly that the complaints stem.
My fellow MP Bill O'Brien and myself have received over the past few years a number of very serious complaints about circumstances arising at Pinderfields Hospital. Bereaved relatives of people who have unfortunately died in the hospital have told us alarming stories of what we believe is a breakdown in the very basic elements of nursing and medical care.
Wakefield MP David Hinchliffe. His concern has been triggered by cases like that of Mabel Ward, an active 92-year-old admitted to Ward Q in 1988 after hurting her hip in a bad fall. She couldn't walk and was in great pain, the classic signs of a hip fracture. But after an X-ray examination, Mrs. Ward was put on a strict regime of what's called mobilisation. She was told she had to walk. She couldn't use a wheelchair, not even to go to the lavatory. When her daughter Jo arrived to visit, she found her mother beside herself with pain.
She said, "You've just got to get me out of here. Nobody will listen to a word I say." She said, "They keep telling me that I've got to walk, and one of the nurses has said, 'Just you wait until tomorrow.'" Now, my mother interpreted that as a threat that she would be made to walk. She said, "Please, please take me home."
Mrs. Ward's pleas were met by strong resistance from the medical staff. But after she'd been in Pinderfields in pain for 3 days, her daughter finally insisted that she be allowed to leave. Back at home, however, her condition didn't improve. She could hardly move, never mind walk. So 8 days later, the hospital consultant paid a home visit.
He said, "Let me see what you can do." And I started off by gently removing the cushions from underneath my mother's foot, and I watched her face to look for signs of hurting, and I did it very gently, very gingerly, so the consultant knew that I considered her to be in agony.
Despite protests from the 2 women that Mrs. Ward had excruciating leg pain which made it impossible to move, he walked over and, taking her arm, told her to get up.
She went forward and her voice went high and she said, "I can't walk, I can't walk." Screamed and fell back into her chair, and as she fell back into her chair, the consultant grabbed the ankle of the injured leg and jerked it up in the air. Her face was absolutely grey. Her breathing, well, it was so shallow that you could hardly notice it. And I was in a state of shock myself. I mean, I'd never witnessed anything like it in my life. Sorry. I feel guilty as well, because I allowed it to happen.
Mrs. Ward had in fact fainted. She was extremely ill, but when she came round and the consultant proposed readmission to Pinderfields, she and her daughter point blank refused. Instead, she was eventually admitted to another local hospital where a junior doctor immediately diagnosed a fractured hip, an injury which Pinderfields had failed to spot, despite an X-ray which required surgery and which had got a good deal worse during the 17 days in which it had gone undiagnosed, while Pinderfields staff tried to make her walk. Mrs. Ward and her daughter subsequently instigated a claim for medical negligence against Wakefield Health Authority. The Wimpole Street consultant they asked to review the case concluded Mrs. Ward had had a very bad deal indeed.
In my opinion, derived from the notes and X-rays provided, there is evidence of medical negligence here at several levels and in several areas.
The Pinderfields NHS Trust disagreed and contested the case, but the wheels of justice grind exceeding slow, and Mabel Ward died in November 1991 before it could come to court. It was only in August last year that her daughter, Jo Kirkham, finally made Pinderfields pay for what it had done to her mother. She received £6,000 in damages after the High Court ruled that the hospital had indeed been negligent. When we began to investigate, we discovered that complaints like those of Jo Kirkham were by no means isolated. Take the case of 80-year-old Elizabeth Peacock, for example, who complained to her MP after being treated at Pinderfields following a mild stroke. Like Mabel Ward, she was a former nurse, and from the moment she arrived, Mrs. Peacock told us, she began to worry about the things she saw around her.
Well, an old lady fell out of bed, and I looked and I saw a nurse come dashing up, and this old lady had fallen out of bed, which is easy done, you know. And they just picked her up, and didn't lift her onto bed, they threw her onto bed. And the tears were rolling down her face. Nobody bothers about her. You know, oh, God, if this is life in here, I'll go home, you know. This was my first day.
Mrs. Peacock was also concerned, she says, about another patient who she saw suffering a severe asthma attack. But when she tried to summon help, she was told to stop interfering. Undeterred, the former nurse continued to demand something was done. Moments later, it was.
Suddenly, two of the night staff, they ran at me, pulled me off my feet, got an arm and a leg each, you know, threw me onto bed, onto the mattress, no pillow, nothing. They rolled me over on my face, and somebody, I don't know who it was, gave me an injection to quieten me.
When Mrs. Peacock woke up the next day, she promptly discharged herself, choosing to be treated by her family doctor at home rather than remain at Pinderfields. Another patient, unhappy about his brief stay at Pinderfields, was Patrick McCarthy, whose family took him to hospital suffering from pneumonia. His granddaughter Jane visited him a few hours later and was distressed to discover he'd already had a bad fall.
He'd cut himself around his face and head and had been left like that. The blood had dried on his face and head. His injuries hadn't been attended to at all. He'd not been sent for an X-ray to see if he'd damaged himself, you know, broken anything. We got one heck of a shock.
An even bigger shock awaited Jane McCarthy when she visited her grandfather again 2 days later. When she couldn't find him in Ward O, she searched the day room. He didn't appear to be there either. Then she noticed an old man sitting in the corner in what looked like familiar clothing. It was her grandfather.
It was horrific. He hadn't been shaved, he hadn't been washed, his hair was dishevelled. His items of clothing that we'd taken were just thrown on, you know, he was minus a shirt. He'd just literally got a pair of trousers on and a vest and cardigan. Dinner was all down his front. Nobody had wiped his mouth. He just looked so unkempt. It was just awful. It was absolutely heartbreaking.
Patrick's family discharged him the next day and took him home, where they summoned a GP to monitor his chest infection.
We had a doctor to him that evening, and the doctor diagnosed double pneumonia. So for all the heartache that we'd seen and he'd suffered over a couple of days, it had been of no benefit at all, and he died 2 days later. He died 2 days later. A very ill old man.
As a result of cases like those of Mabel Ward, Patrick McCarthy and Elizabeth Peacock, the acute care services for the elderly at Pinderfields began to acquire a certain reputation in the Wakefield area. An unenviable reputation, but one well known to care professionals like community nurse Moira Griffin. But it wasn't until Mrs. Griffin and her husband took on the care of 78-year-old John Joyce that she realised how that reputation was deserved. Mr. Joyce was a close friend of the Griffin family, and when his wife died, he went to live with them, quickly settling in and becoming a grandfather figure to the Griffins' young daughter.
Anne-Marie thought the world of him. Little notes all around the bedroom, I love you, and she'd buy him hearts with I love you on at Christmas time and that sort of thing, you know. He was just a lovely old man, a dear old man.
After 8 years living with the Griffins, Mr. Joyce developed a pain in his leg, which made it almost impossible for him to walk. And so in August 1991, he was admitted to Pinderfields. To nurse Moira Griffin, the symptoms suggested that John Joyce was suffering from some form of blood clot and would need complete bed rest while detailed investigations were made. But staff at Pinderfields had other ideas.
When I went in that evening, one of the patients greeted me with, "He's been on the floor twice today." And I asked John about this. I says, "What do you mean you've been on the floor, John?" And they said they tried to walk me, and I can't walk. And I says, "Well, I know you can't walk." I says, "They shouldn't have walked you." I said, "I must have a word with the ward sister about this." So on the way out, I approached the ward sister and I asked her about this incident. And it was true that she'd forced him to walk and he'd ended up slumped to the floor twice, cutting his leg. And she just turned round and she said, "The reason he won't walk, Mrs. Griffin, is because he's been spoilt."
Though doctors agree that John Joyce probably was suffering from a blood clot, it was 2 weeks before he received an arteriogram to locate a possible clot. And though the result was positive, it was a further 10 days before doctors began to devise a treatment plan. In the meantime, John had developed severe diarrhea, which, because he couldn't walk, was causing problems, with one nurse in particular.
She was just passing with the tea trolley and he just said, "She's a bitch." And I says, "John, you shouldn't say that." And then he started crying and he said, "She shouted at me this morning and she led me out of the ward in front of everybody with a bucket under me." And it really, really distressed him, there's no doubt about it. He was very, very upset about that.
As the days went by, with Mr. Joyce becoming increasingly fearful of the hospital's attempts to make him walk, Moira Griffin became increasingly worried that nothing was being done to treat the blood clot. No matter how much she pestered the staff, there didn't seem anything they could say.
I'd tried to collar them at the end of it when I was leaving the ward, and I'd try to ask them, "Well, you know, what's happening next to John?" And I could never get a proper answer. And this just went on and on and on. And he just didn't seem to be getting anywhere. He was just clearly deteriorating in front of everybody's eyes.
Most worrying of all was the gradual discoloration of John's right leg. To Moira Griffin's trained eyes, it could only mean one thing: gangrene. And every day she pulled back his bed covers to see the condition steadily worsening.
It was his toes and his foot, first of all. And then over the following couple of weeks, it went right up to his knee. His leg was pitch black and it was wet and it stuck out. He wasn't able to straighten it. It was stuck out all the time and he was barely conscious. They were just watching him slowly dying of gangrene.
What was required, Moira knew, was immediate medical action, and when that action wasn't forthcoming, she decided she'd had enough and sought permission to take John home. At first, doctors agreed, and Moira prepared for her friend's homecoming. But on the day of the planned discharge, she was told that only the amputation of John's gangrenous leg could save his life, and the hospital was only prepared to carry out the operation if Moira Griffin was prepared for the burden of care when the patient went home. The alternative was to leave him to die of gangrene. John Joyce's life was now in Moira Griffin's hands.
I met a consultant and there was a nurse with him at the time, and I remember he just ushered the nurse out. He says, "Could you just go and have a look at Mrs. So-and-so?" He found an excuse of getting her out of the room anyway, and he just turned around to me very bluntly and he said, "Do you want this gentleman to die?" And of course I told him in no uncertain terms that I didn't want him to die, you know. And he says, "Because we can put him on painkillers. He will die very quickly." And this was really sprung at me, and to hear that somebody actually said you want somebody to die, you know, it's horrific.
For Moira, the decision was simple. The operation went ahead, and John was brought home a month later, though he was never to be the same man again.
I remember the first day he came home, and his GP called, and John started crying. And I said to his GP, I said, "He's not crying because he's unhappy." And I said to John, "Why are you crying, John?" He says, "Because I'm home." It was that sort of tears of happiness. It was nothing short of a miracle.
John Joyce died in March 1992, and, like others before her, Moira Griffin set about seeking redress from the hospital she thought it had a major hand in his death. She didn't want money, she just wanted the facts exposed, so the same couldn't happen to other old people. At first, the local Wakefield Health Authority denied there was any cause for concern. But when Mrs. Griffin persisted in her complaints through the local Community Health Council, 2 independent medical consultants concluded otherwise.
The 10-day delay in obtaining an arteriogram was unacceptable. Mr. Joyce's condition deteriorated considerably during this delay, and the standard of clinical notes kept during this critical period fell far short of acceptable levels. We were also concerned that therapeutic options, including amputation, were not discussed. The care Mr. Joyce received had overall been well below acceptable standard.
Though the health authority had initially disputed the complaints, at a subsequent review, the medical director of the NHS Trust, Dr. John Settle, said he felt ashamed to be working in a place where such treatment could happen. But happen it did, and in the month the report on John Joyce's case was published, August last year, Michael Hooley was pressing for his 80-year-old mother Nellie to be allowed home from Pinderfields. She'd been admitted 4 months earlier after a stroke, and from the start, Mr. Hooley told us, he was concerned about the standard of care. On several occasions, he'd found her dirty with food stains caked around her mouth, without stockings and shoes on the bare ward floor, and, worst of all to Michael, lying in her own urine.
I live on my own and I have to look after my mum, and I had to do everything. I had to bathe her and everything, and toilet her and everything. And obviously she'd only been in there 2 days, and I found her in a state that she'd never been in at home. And a few more days later it happened again.
But when Michael succeeded in persuading hospital authorities to discharge his mother, he discovered she was suffering from a severe bed sore, which had developed during her time in Pinderfields. For help, he called out a local nurse. It turned out to be Moira Griffin.
And she just gasped in horror at the sight. And immediately she said, well, what we'll have to do is we'll have to have the GP. But when the GP saw it, I mean, it went from bad to worse. I mean, he just looked at me and shook his head and said, Michael, I just don't know what to say.
It was that bad. She started vomiting blood, if I can remember, and we had to admit her into Pinderfields, and the nursing staff there, in actual fact, I heard them say, oh, you know, they were shocked when they took this dressing off.
She was admitted again to exactly the same ward that she was before. And to be honest, we went along exactly the same path again. It was almost unbelievable. I really was disappointed. Apparently, there wasn't a doctor that had actually had the bandage off and looked at the sore. Now, this went on for 14 days.
Nellie Hooley remained at Pinderfields a further 8 weeks, with her son Michael visiting for several hours every day, until one Saturday morning last October, when he arrived to find his mother making strange gurgling noises.
She seemed to have a problem with her chest. And I had a word with the sister, and the sister said, yes, I think your mum's got a chest infection, and we'll have the doctor to have a look at her. He didn't think my mum had a chest infection, and my mum died the next day of pneumonia. And I was just devastated.
What did you think then about her treatment?
Well, I haven't been happy with the treatment all along. I did make a complaint in September. My mum was still alive then. And I run a business. I only deal in paper and print. But I know if I have a complaint from a customer, it's got to be dealt with straight away. And yet, the hospital, I've had my complaint now since September, and to this day, I still haven't had anyone to see exactly what the problem is. And I just find it difficult to believe that I'm dealing in paper and ink and they're dealing in lives.
For the local Community Health Council, the nature and consistency of the complaints about the geriatric services at Pinderfields has been a matter of concern. The chairman, Ron Benford, told us that though he believes Pinderfields is far from alone in its problems, the fact is there are likely to be many more unhappy patients than those who've actually complained.
In general, elderly people are not vocal. They don't complain. They're reluctant, they're frightened, they're concerned. The cases that we've come across, I would assume, they are the tip of the iceberg. I think as the elderly care service has been operated, it has been a national scandal.
Many of those who've complained about Pinderfields have turned eventually for help to their local MPs, among them Bill O'Brien.
When people started to relate to me what their family that suffered, then I realised that this problem goes deeper and wider than just a single or the couple of cases that I picked up.
So Mr. O'Brien took the matter up with the Department of Health. He was subsequently assured by the Health Minister, Tom Sackville, that an investigation was underway. It was an assurance Mr. Sackville repeated in the House of Commons.
I am aware there have been 3 incidents involving elderly people, of which care has fallen well below the standards we would expect. Now, he is also aware that the Nuffield Institute are investigating by contacting the families of those patients over the last few years, and there is also an internal inquiry led by 2 consultants from Manchester and Cornwall into these cases.
Relatives and carers who'd made complaints, among them Joe Kirkham and Moira Griffin, were delighted and relieved at what they took to be a promise by the Minister that the investigation by the Nuffield Institute of Health would take account of their views.
Well, I was elated about it, and I felt that everything would be unearthed and people would be able to voice their opinions and get facts over.
I sat back and thought that my mother's case would be examined, and I expected to be interviewed.
But the elation and relief were short-lived.
No one came, no one wrote, we didn't hear a thing.
I waited patiently for several weeks, and eventually I began to feel a bit uneasy. So I wrote to the person in charge, Professor somebody or other, and his personal assistant wrote back to say that they knew nothing whatsoever about this survey.
Dear Mrs. Kirkham, we have made extensive inquiries at the Nuffield Institute for Health, but we have not had any success in identifying any researchers conducting an investigation in the area you mention in your letter.
In fact, it later turned out that the Nuffield Institute was indeed working on a brief from the Pinderfields NHS Trust, but the much-vaunted investigation was, at Pinderfield's behest, in fact no more than a review of the experiences of a small, random sample of former patients. When we contacted the Trust to put to it the complaints you've heard today, no one was prepared to take part in an interview to answer questions. Instead, we were issued with a written statement from the Trust's Chief Executive, Barry Fisher.
We are very sorry for any distress which may have been caused to individual patients and their carers, and I can promise that all complaints about services at Pinderfields are treated very seriously and positive action is taken. I cannot comment about individual cases which are confidential to the patients concerned, but I can say that the numbers of complaints we receive are still very low compared to the numbers of patients we treat. Around 2,500 elderly patients are treated each year, and we receive very many letters of thanks from satisfied patients and their relatives.
The statement went on to say that following reviews of medical issues and nursing care, the hospital is implementing a 7-point plan which integrates care of the elderly with care of other patients. New staff have been appointed to lead the change, which will involve better training.
All these actions have one very clear objective: to ensure that Pinderfields has the very best in elderly care services in the shortest possible time, and the Trust will not rest until that objective is achieved.
Whether all the changes introduced at Pinderfields will be enough to reassure local old folks, however, remains to be seen. As we've heard, a number of people who've complained about the treatment of their loved ones remain to learn what the hospital has to say. And until they do, they fear the reputation of its geriatric ward. 76-year-old Renee Smale's husband, Fred, was admitted in April 1991 for a chest condition and almost immediately had a bad fall.
A doctor saw him when he fell, and I was told that he was only badly bruised. But I wanted him to have an x-ray to see if anything had been broken or anything.
Did they x-ray him?
They did, 38 hours afterwards.
And he never really got better?
No, he just got worse and worse and worse. And, I mean, he was crying. He was crying to me, and I don't know, there was something wrong then.
So what do you think now, really, looking back on it, about the hospital and its treatment?
Well, it's made me feel that I don't want to go into Pinderfields Hospital. If anything happens to me, I shall be afraid. I told my doctor when he came to see me, I said, don't send me to Pinderfields.
Face the Facts was presented by John Waite and produced by Susan Mitchell. The editor is Graham Ellis.